Hello, everyone. My name is Amanda Wick, and I am the curator for the Charles Babbage Institute Archives. On behalf of the First Fridays Committee and the Ask Department, welcome to our hybrid First Fridays, and welcome especially to our in-person and online audience members. This season's theme is It's All Fun and Games. We will investigate materials in the archives that are strictly recreational. Today's presentation will also be posted later on the University of Minnesota Library's YouTube channel, so you should be able to access it within the next few weeks. First Fridays is a monthly series of presentations made possible by a generous gift from Governor Elmer L. Anderson and Mrs. Eleanor Anderson in honor of former library director, Dr. Edward B. Stanford. The presentations are based on materials in the University Library's archives and special collections. A special thank you to Alan and Tammy from Middle English Interpreting, who will be providing ASL interpretation for today's presentation. If time allows, we will have Q&A at the end. If the Zoom audience members have any questions for our speaker today, you should submit them using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Please use that function as opposed to chat so that we can keep track of those questions. In-person audience members, please hold your questions to the end. At the end of today's presentation, there will be a tour of the caverns with our colleague Kate Dietrich. She's right back there, green shirt, polka dots. She will be awaiting everyone just outside of this door. I'd like to pause for a moment for our land acknowledgement that the University of Minnesota Twin Cities is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It is important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for our American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. Our presentation today is Fun with a Purpose, Pageants and Parades in the Social Welfare History Archives. It is presented by Linnea Anderson, the archivist for the Social Welfare History Archives. Pageants, festivals, parades, and exhibitions were popular activities in the early 20th century community centers and recreation departments. These events used patriotic, historical, cultural, and literary themes to entertain and educate. Come join the fun for stories that range from neighborhood festivals to major civic productions with casts of thousands and elaborate sets, costumes, music, and dancing. And again, if you are interested in the tour afterwards, Kate will be out there. The Sherlock Holmes exhibit just went up and it is in the exhibit hall just across the way. So join us again and in person on April 7th for Checkmate, the untold story of computer gaming from the Charles Babbage Institute Archives, and the games we play from the University Archives. Thank you for attending today, and please look for the presentation on YouTube.
Thank you, Amanda. Aren't they wonderful? One of my favorite photos. So before I get started, a note about language when referring to Native Americans in this presentation. When I am quoting the sources, I will use the term Indians. Otherwise, I will be using Native American or Indigenous. So I had planned to talk about both pageants and parades, but I had to focus on pageants in the interest of time and because honestly, I just cannot get enough of pageantry. These dramatic spectacles were popular in the 1910s and 20s across the US. They ranged from more modest productions with 100 to 300 cast members to massive events with casts of thousands and audiences in the tens of thousands. Recreation programs, community centers, and other groups threw themselves into planning, producing, and performing. There were even professional pageant masters and directors who wrote scripts and articles and how-to guides or traveled to communities to lead productions. Pageants were developed with civic, social, and political purposes in mind. They educated, they celebrated, and also presented historical memory on the public stage. Pageants were viewed as a serious undertaking, or as one review explained, the creation of a new art form is a strenuous and a solemn thing. Today, we'll have some fun with the oddities and grandiosity of pageants, but also take a look at a few of their more serious and problematic aspects. I'll explore the motivation and methods behind them, common plots, themes, and characters, and their backstage production. And this talk is based on several collections in the Social Welfare History Archives, including articles from the pages of Survey, Charities, and Playground magazine, collections such as the YWCA of Minneapolis, United Neighborhood Houses of New York, the National Recreation Association, and the National Federation of Settlements. The records start to mention pageants around 1907, but the trend really seems to take off around 1909, 1910. So what purpose did these pageants serve in the busy agenda of these social service and recreation professions? The answer, like many you find in the archives, is complex. And when you begin to interrogate the themes and imagery of pageants and the language around them, it's clear they fit very well with the methods and agenda of social work and recreation at this time. They reflected a mix of educational, cultural, and community-focused programming, but I would also argue that they included a heavy dose of American and Eurocentric mythology and romanticism, and reflected some reactionary and social control impulses about urbanization and immigration. So let's start with education. The archives documents programs designed to educate the community and present the right way, or the American way, to do just about everything. We have a few examples here that included classes, exhibitions, demonstrations, and window displays, and festivals and informational parades literally took the message to the streets and to the parks. Pageants were also a tool for education, both for the participants and the audience. Descriptions of a 1913 religious missions pageant in Chicago stated that pageants were a chance to scientifically relate the use of the dramatic instinct to other educational processes. The Hudson-Fulton celebration in 1909, commemorating the 300th anniversary of Henry Hudson's exploration of the Hudson River and the 100th anniversary of Robert Fulton's paddle steamer, included pageants and 2 weeks of celebration in the New York City area. And we have a slide here, and the quality of some of the slides, the photos in these is not that great, but I just wanted to include them anyway because the images are so wonderful. A lot of these are from old publications. So from the Hudson-Fulton celebration, we have children's groups on parade. There's a Viking longboat, Miss Liberty and the Colonial Girls, and something representing the original 13 colonies. And this event was partly an educational exercise in which 500,000 children from schools and playground programs and church groups researched and made their own costumes, floats, and banners. And pageants also reflected the importance of the arts and were actually viewed as a new art form. Arts events were designed to entertain, but also to uplift and educate and dilute cultural differences. Documents in the archives are filled with language about beauty and the finer things and refinement that would counter what was described as a dark, congested, and unwholesome living or working conditions in urban, immigrant, and working class communities. And the young in particular were thought to benefit from exposure to the arts that would protect them from old world ways and the gritty urban surroundings. And similarly, pageants were informed by the values of the playground and recreation movement. Play advocates promoted the importance and role of play, especially in urban areas. And Jane Addams, quoted in Playground magazine in 1907, stated, "Only in the modern industrial city have men concluded that it is no longer necessary for the municipality to provide for the insatiable desire for play." And the play movement looked back, undoubtedly with rose-colored glasses, at past civic traditions and lamented the lack of beauty, space, and health in the modern city. Play served as an antidote to modern life, improved health, promoted civic spirit, and helped youth develop into citizens. Pageants were part of this broader strategy, and they were thought to hearken back to public, civic, and ceremonial gatherings of the past. A 1925 article describes pageants as a form of entertainment that makes it possible to bring back to modern life some of that community spirit in play, which has so marked former times and in which we have been so lamentably deficient. So community-based programming and community organizing methods were also key to pageants. And pageants were a source of civic pride, both watching and producing them. And an article published in 1910 explained that a pageant, be it remembered, is not to be compared to an ordinary show of dramatic performance. It is rather a new tool for community education and civic enterprise. And you can see here in the advertisement for the Pilgrim pageant, where they're talking about community pride, history, and service. And then the caption for the Pageant of the Nations photo says, "A folk product entirely. This pageant brought together 17 immigrant groups." And descriptions of a pageant in Monroe, Michigan in 1926 stated that it is a performance that is not only beautiful, but has meaning and draws from the experiences of the actors for its expression. And virtually every pageant documented in the archives was a volunteer community event, even those that hired professionals for some roles in production staff. They relied on community volunteers to produce and perform. Everyone from the children in the community center nursery to youth clubs, grade schools, high school and college students, fraternal organizations, civic groups, women's clubs, and business associations took part, whether behind the scenes or in front. And a 1923 article about a playground pageant in East Orange, New Jersey declared, "The only qualification is the desire to take part. The eagerness of the candidate to participate is worth more than any dramatic ability." So these community connections were actually viewed as a key element of the pageant art form. Thus, not only was art recognized as a civic force, but in turn, civic and social cooperation was recognized as an art, explained an article on the pageant of Cape Cod in 1914. Or as the ad in the slide says, pageants were cooperative creation. So related to their community focus, pageants were also a tool for promoting Americanization, acculturation, and citizenship. They reflected a response to immigration that both celebrated immigrant cultures in the form of costumes, dances, and music, but also feared the foreign-born, as they were called. Social service and recreation professionals worked to Americanize people viewed as alien and to moderate and control cultures and behaviors viewed as threatening and un-American. So how do you present your idea of civic responsibility, citizenship, and history to a large audience of diverse educational, language, and cultural backgrounds? You put on a show, a big show. Pageants and their community focus became a tool to Americanize the newcomer. So you can see here, this is an example. This is the Pageant of Newark. This is the final great procession in which all the peoples of the world apparently walk around sort of in a messy and muddled circle, but that kind of gives you an idea of the scale of some of these. So not only the message and the theme of the pageant, right, but also the act of coming together to produce the spectacle were intended to reinforce community patriotism and citizenship. And they celebrated a vision of democracy, American greatness and progress with sweeping historical narratives. And the immigrants are shown as becoming part of a longer historical trend towards American greatness and unity. So you have the young women here from the local YWCA celebrating their ethnic costumes. So let's take a look at some examples of common themes, plots, and types of pageants and characters. Pageants were a mashup of history, patriotism, myth, cultural appropriation, civics, and boosterism, with oddly placed interludes of medieval and merry old England scenes, Shakespeare scenarios, fantasies of fairies, knights and ladies, literary characters, and classical Greek and Roman history and myths. And almost no pageant escaped without reinforcing stereotypes or historical myths about ethnic groups, national origins, and Native Americans. Each pageant reflected the location that produced it and incorporated local history, people, and culture, but there were similar elements that appeared in virtually all pageants at this time period. Pageant descriptions, reviews, and instructions reveal a common set of elements and narrative structure. There was often a prologue that set the stage, probably a plum roll. Dramatic scenes and tableau provided the narrative arc of main events, either historical, mythological, or symbolic. while masks, music, and dance interludes emphasized the themes, bridged between the scenes, and provided roles for the large cast. And many pageants also included a grand processional or recessional of all of the characters. And this slide here, you can see just a snippet from a musical score that's using this sort of faux Old English language as everyone sings about our May Day lady and dances around in circles. And then this fabulous sort of fairies with flowers dancing around the enchanted human figure scene. I love these. So one theme in particular that I want to explore is the idea of history as progress. American pageants developed the idea of portraying future history, that's a quote, as well as past events. Pageants took the audience from scenes of nature and indigenous people who were presented as primitive yet noble, or primitive and savage, to an era of exploration and colonization. And this was usually followed by a romanticized, heroic past origin story scene featuring explorers and pioneers. And then there were scenes about famous firsts, facts, and characters, and scenes celebrating civilization and technical development, leading finally to glorious visions of an idealized future. And this character here, you may not be able to see, is called the Spirit of Prophecy, whose costume appears to be a bedsheet, I'm not sure, carrying a birch branch, and in the back there's a canoe. We can kind of picture him being paddled up onto the shore of the lake and, predicting the great future of America. So a key element of this narrative, though, was to show Native American peoples sort of romantically living in the woods or on the prairie and greeting and welcoming and explorers, and then selling their land, and then helping or fighting the settlers, and then just sort of leaving to make way for progress, civilization, and the arrival of more white settlers, and then the arrival of the immigrants. And then the immigrants in turn retain the pride in their own story while fitting in and adopting American ways as part of their place in history. And there's a pageant titled From Cave Life to City Life, very ambitious, that was staged in Boston in 1910. And it reflects this history as progress theme, as well as many other common elements of pageants, such as symbolic characters and dances. Unfortunately, I could not find any photos of this pageant. So episode 1 shows the cave dweller in his solitary home, or what I like to refer to as the cave patriarchy scene. And then Father Time appears in the mouth of the cave and chants an invitation to labor, progress, success, prosperity, peace, and happiness, all represented symbolically, to assist man in his work. Episode 2 included a symbolic dance about the Indians who welcomed the Norsemen. And in this case, the real Indians, with quotes touted as cast members, may actually have been real. A description of the pageant referred to Iroquois cast members and noted that they had recently been producing a play about Longfellow at Chautauqua. I tried to find more information on that too and didn't have any luck. In the third episode, wait for it, the colonists appear, hundreds of them, followed by scenes of war with Native Americans, a Thanksgiving feast, old games, and group scenes of a dame school, a spinning school, a quilting party, and singing. And then everyone joins in a minuet dance. And then a symbolic dance, right? And then a symbolic dance bridged to the next scene and represented the passing of the Indian. As noted earlier, the idea of Native peoples making way for progress reinforced dominant narratives about history. And the fourth episode, titled Present Success and Future Development, peered into the city of the future, and I'm quoting now, where disease shall be abolished and justice shall reign supreme, and predicted that there would be an assimilation of all nations into the true American city. And then the scene closed with a recessional parade that clearly celebrated progress. It included an electric car, yes, an electric car, running on Edison batteries. And above the group of old-time conveyances was suspended a Starling Burgess airplane, sort of an early airplane company model here. And then the final episode suggests that the drama of pageants sometimes just got plain weird. Dust clouds and disease germs attacked the city and were repelled by the Knights of Economy. And then fire and flame dances try to break into the city of the future to no avail. So the theme of history and progress included a lot of ideas about manifest destiny and the triumph of Christian Western civilization, as exemplified by the 1913 missionary pageant in Chicago. And there were tableaux of immigrants arriving at Ellis Island. You can see them here all crowded onto the stage. There were prairie schooners showing westward expansion, trading posts and missionaries, and the development of railways and cities. And there were also tableaux about the conflict between darkness and light, which was another very common theme, and celebrating the connections between missions and human progress. And then there was something completely indecipherable pictured here on the left about the Sheikh's wife and David Livingston. I have no idea what's going on there. Probably, but you can see how it sort of represents, here's supposedly the undeveloped world being rescued by, Western Christianity, right? So the sources in SWHA document a wide variety of pageants and reasons for producing them. And we'll explore just a few examples today. Pageants celebrated the history of a particular community and location and were described as living pictures which unfold the history of any community. The town is often described as a character and the town history as the plot. And they also tried to put their local history into a national context. So you can see, it's probably hard to read, but this is just an excerpt from an article about how do you write a pageant that's the history of your own town. And it gives a series of questions that you can answer to help sort of develop a script. But it's also kind of gives you an example of how you could end up with a pageant with a very narrow idea of whose history should be told and how it should be told. And then the Philadelphia Historical Pageant in 1912 celebrated the city's national role. There were scenes of William Penn, the Declaration of Independence, Revolutionary War, Ben Franklin in France, President and Mrs. Washington, the War of 1812, General Lafayette, and a Native American scene that was played by children from the Carlisle boarding school. Yeah. So the old Deerfield Historical Pageant in 1910 featured the town of Deerfield, Massachusetts. And scenes included Merry England of 1630, in which rustics are having a great time dancing around the maypole in a scene described as a kaleidoscope of color and overflowing with animation. And then these same rustics scoff at a long line of Puritans about to set out for the New World. I'm really not sure this scene had the intended effect, even in 1910, but this was followed by an Indian home life scene with a classic plot device showing the sale of land and the arrival of the first white settler. And then cast members also staged the events of a raid on Deerfield in 1704, and part of that scene is seen here, by Native Americans and French soldiers, and subsequent scenes of captives in Canada and the return of some to the town. This is actually quite a famous historical incident. And like many historical scenes of conflict in pageants, the complex interactions and events surrounding it were smoothed over by a simpler and unifying historical narrative. And pageants were often credited with creating direct connections to past events and bringing back former virtues and characteristics, which I also view as part of their Americanization and political motivation. An article on the Deerfield pageant claimed the staid Puritan spirit was again felt as in the old meeting house. The impression that visitors to the Deerfield pageant will take away with them is of a village really living scenes that have become part of their lifeblood. Even the children attained the quaint reserve of Puritan children. And then casts were another way that pageants made connections with the past more immediate. More than one article mentions, for example, the symbolic importance when the descendants of pioneers play their ancestors. And this photo is from a production at Hull House Settlement in Chicago, and it is of the character Ajax being played by a Greek resident of the neighborhood who is an immigrant. And a 1921 Armistice Day pageant hit the Kiowee Trail in the Piedmont region of South Carolina, used actual historical documents and artifacts borrowed from local families for promotional window displays and as research materials for the pageant. Papers and letters telling of significant happenings allied with South Carolina's very being were taken out of antique desks and sent to the pageant committee. All right, all the archivists out there, just take a deep breath. Pageants also celebrated national or cultural anniversaries and events, such as the 1916 Shakespeare 300th anniversary pageant, Caliban of the Yellow Sands, featuring characters from The Tempest. This literary themed high culture event was produced in a venue with seating for 50,000 people, with professional actors in some roles and famous dancer Isadora Duncan performing a dance interlude. And the 300th anniversary of the Pilgrim arrival in 1920 was a significant focus of pageant activity. Playground magazine declared to join the Pilgrim Tercentenary celebration is a matter of patriotism. It issued articles with production suggestions, including a pageant where one of the pilgrims, half dreaming over his book, sees a vision of America in future years. So there's that future history again. There was advice on where to get costume information and source materials for sets and props, including where to find red brick paper at 25 cents a roll. This is excellent for pilgrim fireplaces. And local libraries were encouraged to set up a special bookshelf labeled Ye Pilgrim Bookshelf, and to stock it with volumes from a suggested list of books on pilgrims and Native Americans. And pageants also celebrated seasonal, patriotic, and religious holidays. And this is the example that is probably still best known today. United Neighborhood Houses of New York had an annual seasonal spring pageant festival, also known as the Peace Festival and the May Day Festival, that was usually staged in the Central Park's North Lawn in early May, or at the auditorium of Wanamaker's department store. So you can see some of the outlines of the scripts for that here. And then the YWCA of Minneapolis, for a more local example, presented an Easter pageant in March 1921 titled Light Unfailing. Newspaper articles described the plot as depicting the struggle between light and darkness through the ages and culminating in the triumph of light. A cast of 200 featured characters such as humanity, time, darkness, light, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. There were musical solos, and the Glee Club sang for the tableau. Dances were a key element as always, including an interpretive dance with a dancer holding a lighted bowl and representing humanity, a rainbow dance, and 8 little girls dressed in yellow and gray giving the dance of the sunbeams and the shadows. The proceeds of 50 cents admission fee were used to send members of the YWCA to summer camp in Lake Geneva, New York. And I could not talk about seasonal pageants in Minnesota without a winter example. The winter pageant One Night in Boreas was staged at a St. Paul's skating rink with a bank of snow topped with a throne and decorated to look like a wooded lakeshore. The pageant was in 12 parts that included a processional with King Boreas, several skating scenes featuring girls in holiday costumes, and then there were scenes of the north wind, snowflakes, and icicles, icicles played by boys in gray costumes with pointed caps on their heads. And then there was Santa Claus and dancing toys. And there were solo figure skating and dance scenes, including the North Star dressed in white steamers with a large gold star on her head. And January, a young lady in sports dress performing a fancy skating exhibition. I'm sorry, I have no photos of this. I wish I did. And a sunbeam character whose dance melts the snowflakes and the icicles, which we could all use a little bit of right now. And then the pageant ended in fireworks and skating clowns, at which point I'm out. And then the pageants also marked public campaigns, such as those focused on health, literacy, or fundraising. A 1924 children's book parade and pageant titled A Day in Romance Land was staged by 350 children representing characters from literature. It marked Juvenile Protection Month and was staged by the Children's Department of the Portland Public Library. And circulation of children's books at the library and sales at local bookstores increased after the event. And the Enchanted Garden, produced in Stamford, Connecticut in 1928, promoted children's recreation programs and child health. And it's a fun example of a let's just throw in everything but the kitchen sink approach to some pageants. So it starts with a dejected child, and in the spirit of play dances with characters of health and joy. And then the play leads the child to health and joy. These are not subtle productions. But in case that's not enough, other episodes feature ancient Greeks, Robin Hood, Morris dancers, games and sports of different nationalities, Native Americans dancing something called a corn dance, and then everyone joining in a Virginia reel, followed by a group sing of America the Beautiful. And the YWCA of Minneapolis even used pageantry as part of its annual meeting. The Wayside Piper pageant and association song celebrated the YW's achievements and services for girls. And in 1921, as you can see in the clipping on the right-hand side there, pageant fever gripped the local Minneapolis YWCA to the extent that the officers presented their annual reports as tableau. Chris, what do you think? Can we do that? Yeah. Okay, this is another one of my favorite photos. Just soak that in for a minute. So one of my favorite aspects of these pageants is the symbolic and sometimes bizarre characters. So this slide shows characters representing the church on the left, Newark City, and the law on the right from the Newark, New Jersey pageant. And pageants often featured a frankly kind of weird mix of mythological, symbolic, historical, and literary characters. And they might serve to celebrate an event, present a particular trait, symbolize a geographic location or natural environment, or a symbolic character could represent a social issue, civic role, or political or social idea. So you can see here from the YWCA, the characters yesterday, today, and tomorrow in their classical garments. So a fabulous and yet wacky example of symbolic characters is the 1926 Chicago Pageant of Safety, titled Pilgrimage of Safety. Presented by 700 children from city playgrounds, the king of the land of carelessness and his careless courtiers are ready to welcome accident victims, which is sort of horrifying, followed by scenes in which the spirit of safety leads humankind away from the land of carelessness, and 5 episodes on the dangers that surround little children, in which children are threatened by characters such as the god of fire and fire demons, and rescued by the knights of the spirit of safety. And other danger characters include water disease, traffic, and shooting and sharp-pointed toys. And disease was represented by a troupe of sneezers, coughers, and spitters, whose costumes were described as covered in horrible-looking microbes. And there was even a battle with the dangerous toys, which the reviewer describes as the liveliest episode. And it's a little hard to see in the photos, but frankly, it looks to me like things just kind of devolved into chaos by the end of this. And so the St. Louis pageant and masque in 1914 seems to be have been thought of as the gold standard of pageants. It was a massive production on the site of the 1904 World's Fair. And in this slide here, you see in the front of the gigantic canoe, the heroic figure of Mississippi representing the river. And way in the back, we hope well secured there, right there, is a child playing the spirit of St. Louis. And in the background is, he's really hard. Oh dear. Nope. In the background, we have Cahokia, the father of the mound builders, sitting on a mound. And the canoe is paddled by river spirits. So it looks like the river spirits are having some trouble because there's also a group of boys in the lagoon helping to push the canoe, which sort of does not have the intended effect, I think. So in the 1921 pageant, The Smith, a civic pageant about Pittsburgh, the Smith is the spirit of the city, bound with chains of gold and misled by his evil counselors, worldly power, pride, complacency, and greed, shown here on the left. Then desolate groups such as the unclean, the joyless, the disinherited, the stricken, and youth in idleness present their woes to the city. And just in case the audience does not get the point, idle youth is changed to a character representing crime. And then in each group explains their plight to civic spirit. For example, an evicted family explains that the law courts are not for us, they're for them that threw us out. Then the desolate are rescued by civic spirit and her ministers, who are government, education, art, social science, state laws, and charities. And then following some extremely dramatic dialogue between civic spirit and the evil counselors, she awakens the Smith with the help of inexplicably the fountain spirits, shown here on the right, who just show up with clean water for the city, and then everyone celebrates, and then the ending sort of appears to fall apart because really they're celebrating that they can serve the Smith, but that's also an example of how to serve the city. And the Hudson Fulton celebration in 1909 that we mentioned earlier included a strange mix of historic, symbolic, and just plain odd characters and scenes. There was Father Knickerbocker, Uncle Sam, milkmaids, dairymaids, and Dutch girls, Henry Hudson and his sailors, and to top off the excesses, a replica of Hudson's ship, the Half Moon, was launched on the Hudson River, where it was crewed by children. We can't discuss characters without acknowledging pageant makers' fascination with Robin Hood characters. And I just love this part. So many of the pageants, many of the productions documented in the archives include some kind of Robin Hood scene. In 1927, a May Day revel on Nottingham Green included Robin and his merry band, dancing milkmaids, shepherds, woodsmen, and villagers, Maid Marian, the Bishop of Hereford, the Sheriff of Nottingham, and his wife and his daughter, more parts for women, St. George and the Dragon, and Morris dancers. An article in Playground from May 1921 gives suggestions on Robin Hood legends, adapted as a May Day celebration, or reads like a word problem in fourth grade math. So we're going to have a quiz. So the action takes place in a large square. First enter 6 young men costumed in leather jerkins. They're followed by 6 maidens and a fine, sleek cow decorated with ribbons and flowers with horns tipped in gold. They are succeeded by 6 foresters dressed in green, carrying bugle horns, which they continuously sound. Next appears Robin Hood, Little John on his right, Will Stuckley on his left, and 10 outlaws following behind. Then came 2 maidens strewing flowers, followed by Maid Marian, beautifully costumed, with 2 bride maidens and 6 other, apparently just regular maidens. And after them came Friar Tuck and Much the Miller's son, and then a maypole drawn by 8 oxen, decorated with scarves, ribbons, and flowers. And it's not clear if that's a reference to decorations on the maypole or the oxen. And then the pageant closed with a hobby horse and a dragon. So if you were keeping track, that's 44 characters, 55 if you count the cow, the oxen, the hobby horse, and the dragon. So pageants also featured real or historical characters, from national figures to local personalities and groups. And the choice and presentation of these characters is one opportunity to take a more serious look at the themes of these productions. There were lots of George Washingtons and Ben Franklins and other political figures, tribal chiefs, explorers, Revolutionary War soldiers, and pioneers, as well as some business leaders and inventors. And these celebrated local and national history, but also reinforced ideas about what kind of history was worthy of being included in a pageant and the import of that history. It's important to take some time here to acknowledge the complex role of Native American history and Indigenous characters and Native American cultural appropriation in pageants. And a common element of virtually every pageant was the misrepresentation of Indigenous peoples. But complicating this is the mix of Native American actors, professional or volunteer, or in the case of the students from the Carlisle School, technically conscripted, and non-Native performers, often pre-teen boys and girls, dressed and acting as Native Americans. And based on descriptions, it's sometimes hard to tell, to separate which real Indians in the cast are actually Indigenous actors and which are cultural appropriation at best and red-face at worst. However, there were Indigenous actors in pageants. A description of a pageant in Michigan includes a tribe of real Indians and make-believe Indians. And this is one of the only sources I found that actually distinguishes between the two. And an article in Playground discusses Native American participants in pageants in Oklahoma and Michigan. And another article notes leading performances by actor Chief Deerfoot, formerly of the Buffalo Bill Cody Show, playing Chief White Wing. And the Indian princess role, Princess Red Wing, was played by Lilia Red Wing, the stage name of actress Lillian Margaret Sincere of the Ho-Chunk Nation, who was born on the Winnebago Reservation and was a survivor of the Carlisle School. So the pageant also featured a large group of Algonquins in a scene where they welcome the Jesuit fathers Hennepin and LaSalle. But misrepresentation and cultural appropriation were more common. Descriptions of Hit the Kiowa Trail provided a detailed example. The pageant was produced in 7 counties in the Piedmont region of South Carolina, where making costumes and props was an educational project that appropriated and diluted Cherokee culture. With discarded loom I'm quoting at length here, with discarded loom harness from the cotton mills, they trimmed interminable yards of crocus sacking and thus made Indian costumes. Out of dyed corn and macaroni, they had strung Indian beads. They had made bows, arrows, hatchets, tom-toms, and gourd rattles, precisely like those of the Cherokee. So keeping in mind that pageants often impacted the school curriculum and could also serve as an impetus for founding historical societies and other civic projects, you can see how these appropriations and ideas would be spread by this pageant activity. So I want to wrap up talking about pageant production. So pageants were definitely fun with a purpose, but they also required a lot of work and coordination. And to start, grand scale and scope were crucial, both in casts, staging, and audience. The size was part of the spectacle and the impact. The Philadelphia Historical Pageant in 1912 involved 9 performances featuring 5,000 performers in a 500-yard wide performance area, with grandstand seating for 18,000. And the city, which was the hero of the pageant, was fully in view and dominated the scene. Scenes were chosen not only for their historical importance, but also for their adaptability to spectacular presentation. The action included also 500 dancing fairies, with a fairy queen and score of fairy godmothers who were probably brought on board to keep track of the 500 children playing the dancing fairies. And a 1925 article about an Oakland Christmas pageant states that there is a new and splendid field in modern social life for the development of a new form of public art based on the massing of great numbers, which are in themselves so significant by mere virtue of their bulk as to be completely impressive and indeed rather intoxicating. In 1922, 5 communities in Michigan staged small-scale pageants and then united for a county pageant featuring 4,500 cast members. And the combined audiences for this event were estimated at 30,000 people. And for comparison, in 1920, the population of St. Clair County, Michigan, where the pageant was produced, was 58,009 people. So the St. Louis pageant and masque in 1914 was staged by a cast of 7,500 in a natural amphitheater with seating for 60,000. And you can see in this slide here, what we're looking at is the set with the scene of the mound builders, but you can see it has these sort of enormous, heroic, almost sort of faux Aztec decorated walls in the background. And then people representing the mound builders coming up with the baskets of dirt and going down on the right. And I'm not sure what's going on in the foreground, but this just gives you an idea of the scale, right, of this production. The scene included an 800-foot wide stage, and at the time that was claimed to be the largest ever constructed. And if you're interested in a comparison, the Metropolitan Opera stage in New York is 103 feet wide, and the Northrop Auditorium stage is 97 feet wide. And as I mentioned earlier, the stage was built over lagoons left over from the 1904 World's Fair. So the huge logistical task of coordinating these large casts and productions was often given to a pageant master or director and a local committee, who then organized hundreds of volunteers from local organizations. And professionals such as teachers, composers, writers, dance instructors, and artists were also involved. And the archive's collections include references to pageant directors and writers, many of whom were women, who traveled around the country to produce pageants and who wrote and sold scripts and wrote articles and how-to guides. So the United Neighborhood Houses of New York distributed these strict instructions for groups from member community centers who were taking part in the May Day festivals, right? So they're instructed sort of to keep track of the kids. Parents are told, stay away until the production is over. Please arrive promptly at such and such a time. Here's what to do with your costumes. And you can see what a huge undertaking some of these events were. So all of this effort required money. Pageant budgets ranged from around $100 to extreme budgets in the hundreds of thousands. They might be funded with community subscriptions, or by charitable groups, or by the city, or by the government. And for the historical pageant of the Champlain Valley, celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Plattsburgh in 1814, New York State and the federal government each contributed $125,000. And I did one of my favorite techniques, which is to run that through an inflation calculator. That's the modern dollar value of over $3,700,000. And an article on the Philadelphia historical pageant reflected on the cost benefit of pageants. If it cannot pay its own expenses, the pageant as a factor in the upbuilding of a wholesome American community life is of little value. It is a beautiful luxury, which but few communities can or will afford. But if such a pageant with careful business management can cover its own cost, the pageant is a powerful force. It will do much to help bring about a finer, greater, and more democratic life than we have ever dreamed. In a postscript, that pageant cost $95,000, and as of November 12th, it was still $15,000 in debt, and the director, who had contributed some of his own funds, had not been paid. So for communities that needed to produce their pageants cheaply, there were plenty of advice available for inexpensive costumes, sets, and props, which brings me to our final topic for the day. So this shows you the scene, the set of Independence Hall that was constructed for the Philadelphia Historical Pageant. And sets might be anything from a simple suggestion of a garden, a cabin, a dais, to elaborate classical temples, historical sets, and symbolic locations. Most pageants were performed outdoors and tried to take advantage of parks and open spaces. This is the Minnesota pageant, staged by members of the YWCA at the camp in Lake Geneva. So just some simple canoes, some flowers, and a lake. And the pageant here, the temple on the left, is from a pageant, I think, celebrating the end of World War I. And then on the right, this is the 1912 pageant Dutch Days on the Hudson, complete with a windmill. And it was proudly declared that it was taking place in a natural amphitheater or perhaps just on a hillside, a little hard to tell. Potted trees or shrubs, banners, and simple backgrounds might set the stage. And for a 1923 pageant on the playground of East Orange, New Jersey, a local bread company loaned their adhesive billboard sign papers that were printed with Mother Goose themes and attached to a frame built by the park's grounds superintendent. And in 1910, the Greek myth Prometheus was presented by members of the Peabody House settlement in Boston for an audience of 5,000. And the article claimed this was the first time in the history of Boston a public playground was used as an outdoor theater. And in another fun detail, 2 sheep were loaned by the park department and tended by a settlement boy clad in goat skin and armed with a shepherd's crook. And there are also stunning examples of grand and professionally designed sets, including these fantastical constructions for the Shakespeare Anniversary Caliban pageant. And again, this is not a great photo, but it gives you an idea of the scale. And then here you can see the actors, right, in the doorways at the bottom. So it gives you an idea of the size of the mask in that set. Costumes were also important. So here we have Ariel on the left and 2 unidentified characters from the St. Louis pageant. This also gives you an idea of the dramatic and heroic acting style in these. Costuming casts took creativity and resourcefulness and quite a lot of volunteer labor from mothers' clubs and other women's groups that probably had a lot of other work to take care of. And some common costume styles were classical drapery, as seen on the slide on the left, and symbolic costumes, such as the death costume for Caliban of the Yellow Sands, or the use of simple, colorful, symbolic or fantasy costumes to suggest a character and symbolize their role. I love this one. So on the right is Mary Queen of Scots scene, showing the very popular sort of medieval Renaissance style costumes. Revolutionary War clothing was also popular. We have the town crier character here. There would be costumes for pilgrims, Puritans, and pioneers, ethnic costumes, and of course, Native American costumes. And for example, a 1920 article on costuming includes tips such as using dark gym suit bloomers as the basis of pilgrim outfits. And you can sort of see that working, right? And we thank our colleagues at the Goldstein Museum of Design for these beautiful photos of gym suits circa 1910 and 1927. So other productions had elaborate and more costly costumes. The Philadelphia pageant costuming was described as notably correct, and it was made under the direction of an artist, a mistress of the wardrobe, and experts in American historical dress and uniforms. And then the woman on the left from the Mask of Liberty, I'm pretty sure represents Joan of Arc here at the bottom. And she's wearing this sort of a very impressive suit of pretend armor, but also sort of the medieval style costumes that were very popular. And then one costume method was actually adapting historical clothing. And I'm not positive that this is an example of that, but it could be. And descriptions of productions discuss the use of historical clothing for costumes and old tools and furnishings as props to bring history back to life. And an article from 1910 celebrates old wardrobes ransacked for prize dresses and uniforms and spinning wheels taken from the parlor and attic and actually used. And while practical, this technique also formed the direct connections between past and present that pageant directors love. The things of the past have been made to live again, used by the people of the present. And we'll wrap up finally with dance. So dance was a key to every pageant. Solo dance parts appear to have been choice roles. A dance interlude added sound and color, entertained the audience, and helped convey the meaning of the pageant. And 4 types of dance in particular were common. Folk dances, including those ubiquitous milkmaids, and Morris dancing. I absolutely love the photo of these awkward teenage people in their Morris dancing costumes. Interpretive dancing, also called nature dancing sometimes. So on the right-hand side, you can see the character representing the spirit of the ocean carving Cape Cod, right? And then on the left is a dance solo being performed at the pageant in Forest Hills, Queens in around 1918. There were also Native American inspired dances. And finally, minuets. Pageant producers could not get enough of minuet. Perhaps it was thought to have a civilizing influence compared to popular dances of the time, or it was an opportunity for large groups to dance in historical scene. Here's another example. Some pageants even employed professional dance instructors to teach the minuet and other dances. A pageant in Michigan apparently used Henry Ford's private dancing instructor, and the Philadelphia pageant had training from a member of the Imperial Society of Masters of Dancing. And some pageants mentioned students at local dance schools taking the principal roles, but other dances were clearly done by local children's groups. And pageants also involved technical innovations in their staging. So a pageant titled The Sun Goddess used the headlights of cars parked in front of the stage to illuminate the set, right? The Philadelphia Historic Pageant coordination was facilitated by a telephone system, which the master of the pageant and the stage manager direct to a nicety, the entrance of the performers and the firing of the cannon to announce the changing of the scenery. And a 1927 Robin Hood pageant even used voiceover, done by a trained cast hidden from the audience with a microphone connected to an amplifier horn. With careful practice and close watching, these voices were so synchronized with those of the acting cast as to create a splendid illusion and add immensely to the dramatic effects. And the article on the pageant claims that this was probably the first use of this technique. It is true that singing voice amplification was coming in around 1925. So this could be a very early example of that type of performance. So in conclusion, just to wrap up, a pageant was seen as it was really a natural outgrowth of some of these existing motivations, right, for education, culture, play, and Americanization. And you can see how it sort of took these techniques and really blew them up on a grand scale. And they blended drama, music, dance, spectacle, history, myth, cultural celebration, and appropriation in a grand and sometimes wacky mashup. They mark holidays and anniversaries and special events, but were also designed to educate, unite, and inspire, and present to the community a specific vision of U.S. history, origins, and culture. And in doing so, however, they smoothed over historical context, curated a narrow vision of what history is to include, and co-opted and misrepresented the stories of some immigrant groups, and particularly of Native Americans, whose folkways and dances were celebrated, but who were depicted as assimilating or making way for the arc of history. Yeah. I can't believe it. We actually have a few minutes. I kept trying to make this less than 50 minutes, but no luck. We actually have a few minutes for questions. Do we have, Kate, is there one from the, okay.
Yeah, we have one online.
Okay.
It's essentially asking about modern events. Is the Minneapolis May Day pageant an example of this type of pageant? Do we still have these kinds of pageants?
Mm-hmm.
And does the Olympics opening ceremony count as one of these types of pageants?
You know, those are great questions. And also aquatennial, right, for example. So it'd be interesting to look into some of these events that we still have now and see how their roots, you know, do they go back into this early 20th century time period? And the same with the Olympics as well, which had a revival somewhat around this time. So that's a great question. Thank you. And I think I saw, was there?
I'll run the mic over right here.
I thought I saw it. Okay. And then I think there was somebody over here. Okay. So this person and then that person.
I was sort of surprised that you didn't have anything about Minnesota's own Hiawatha pageant.
Yeah. I was basing the talk on what was in the social welfare archives. So unfortunately, nothing about that was covered, but that would be interesting to look into as well. And then there's someone over here. Oh, here comes Mike. Thanks, Kate.
So actually, what is a pageant?
So a pageant is a form of drama, but it's one that has specific elements that include a mask, which would sort of be a symbolic and courtly scene, sometimes presented literally in masks, sometimes just in elaborate costumes. It would have dramatic scenes in which people would act out an event. In the case of a lot of these, an historical event. It would also have what was called pantomime, in which people would act out the scenes, but silently, and maybe there would be music or a narrator to help you understand. And then, as we were talking about here at the end, they would also include what were called interludes. And a lot of those would be a dance interlude. So you'd have a scene, and while they're changing the scenery, maybe, the fairy dancers come out or the Native American dancers come out and entertain the audience and also kind of reinforce the message or the feeling of the previous scene or the scene that's coming up. There also might be processionals. If you think of these as sort of grand events that are harking back not only to sort of courtly, spectacles of the past, but also sort of grand ceremonial events and processions, and also bringing in the techniques of drama and music and the arts. So just a big mashup of a lot of different elements. Great question. Thank you. Anything? Yep.
Hi, you answered part of it. I was wondering how the sound of these pageants and these plays would get to thousands and thousands of people.
Yeah.
You mentioned pantomime, and that makes sense, but how did they reach everybody?
Well, the voice megaphones, like actual voice amplification, started around the 1910s with Magnavox. I sort of stumbled on that while going down a rabbit hole for this. I don't know if that kind of not voiceover, but actually just sort of having loudspeakers was used for these. But I really feel like they relied more on the sets, or those classic theatrical techniques of a set that could direct the sound, really loud voices. And you saw the huge gestures of the people who were presenting these characters. And then also they did employ people who might do the narration of the scene. And then I think they also tried to really do this with gesture and color and shape and movement and dance and music, rather than with a lot of dialogue, because there's a few that articles I found where they talk about how this is a good way to present things to people who don't speak English, because they can watch the action and understand what's going on. I don't have any way to find out from these audiences what they really thought was going on, but so it wasn't a dialogue heavy production. Any other? Oh, someone over there. Great questions. Thank you, everyone.
Did you put together this wonderful presentation from archives that were already assembled, or did you put it together yourself?
We always do the presentations from the collections that are here in the archives, and we don't pull things out of those collections to do these presentations. We just study the collections. We look at the materials that are in the folder. We read the old magazines. We search through the guides that the archivists create to these collections to help find what boxes and folders do we need to look at based on the topic for the theme. So just about everything in this presentation was from the Social Welfare History Archive. Some of it's been digitized and it's available in new media, like the issues of Survey Magazine, for example. In some cases, I had to go to online digital libraries to look at Playground Magazine. And there's one or two images that come from other sources, such as the costume bloomers from the Goldstein Gallery and the photo of the airplane. Yeah, the talks really focus on the specific collections in an individual archive or archives. So, yeah. Question? Really appreciate the great questions, everyone. It looks like we're just about at time. And then just a reminder, as Amanda mentioned earlier, we have a wonderful exhibit on Sherlock Holmes across the hall. Kate will be giving a tour. She's in the back. And next month, come back for more fun and games. We're going to have Checkmate from the Charles Babbage Institute and the games people play from the University Archives. So thanks so much, everyone.